how are you? Welcome on in.
Podcast by George.
Another podcast by George.
Podcast by George. Border to border. Coast to coast. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Got a big show today. Got one of my favorite guests of all time. He's been on a couple of times. He's written a book, and let me hold it up here. There it is. The Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. This guy is one of the world's foremost authorities on the case of Julian Assange, and it is so important. It frustrates me to a certain extent that I can't get more people to understand what's going on. And on a local level, maybe people here in the heartland saw on my Facebook and YouTube pages and places like that, Chris Gloninger, the meteorologist here in the heartland, the weatherman, for God's sake, that frames weather in the context of climate change, which everyone should be doing. Matter of fact, that's why I had him on my show. Well, he quit. He had to, for his own peace of mind and for the safety of himself and his family, because somebody was threatening his life, for God's sake, for talking about climate change. Now, that's a little different than what we're going to be talking about today, folks, but it's like they're all coming for us. And they're coming for Julian Assange. And as I mentioned, Kevin Gosztola is coming back on the Podcast by George live line. Now, Kevin's spent the last decade reporting on Assange, WikiLeaks, and the wider war on whistleblowers. He is co-founder and managing editor of Shadowproof, an independent news outlet focused on systemic abuses of power in business and government, and the curator of the Dissenter newsletter. Gosztola also produces and co-hosts the weekly podcast, Unauthorized Disclosure. His work has appeared in outlets such as The Nation, Salon, Common Dreams, Truth Out. He's been a featured guest on Democracy Now!, The Real News Network, Counterspin, and Al Jazeera English. And of course, I am proud to say also on Podcast by George. Let's click a button and say good morning to our good buddy or good pal and get him on in here and say hi to Kevin Gosztola. Hi, Kevin.
Good morning.
Yeah, congratulations on this book. I was telling Kevin as we went on, for folks, I mean, you can get this book just about anywhere books are sold. It's a great book. I always respected your work in terms of the newsletter and doing the podcast and these public appearances where you go and speak about Assange. But writing a book, folks, it's different. It's a different kind of an animal. It's not bits and pieces. It all has to be sewn together, and it has to flow. It has to be a page turner to get you to continue to want to read it and learn from it. And that's exactly what this book does. Congrats, Kevin, on a great book.
Well, thank you for that. I've had some support from pretty influential people. It's got a foreword from Abby Martin, who's an absolutely incredible journalist and a skilled documentary filmmaker. And I've got a couple book events coming up. If anybody who listens to your show is in the Baltimore area or near Virginia, Arlington, Virginia, or DC, on August 19th and 20th, I believe, August 19th and 20th. I'm going to be there. So it's a Saturday and then Sunday event. The Sunday event is with CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou. We're doing this together and speaking in Alexandria. And so I've had some pretty great support. I was telling you that Chris Hedges was the first to interview me. He was just out with a really important piece on what could happen to Julian Assange next. And he was on a trip. He went to London. There are some other journalists, people who are well known, who traveled to London for a big demonstration this past weekend in Parliament Square in London. And then they were at a kind of private birthday gathering to show support for Julian Assange, who's still in prison, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. And as you mentioned, Chris Hedges is over there with a bunch of other folks covering this. And, they do have the demonstrations, the protests, the appearances. But there's also some talk that his extradition now, because of what's happening illegally, is imminent, that they're going to throw a hood over his head, put him on a cargo plane, and bring him back to the United States here. I thought maybe last week or maybe this week. I mean, is that just conjecture? Is there some reason to believe that?
Yeah, so fortunately, the CIA won't be the ones involved in transferring him, so I don't think he has to worry about the hood. But I do believe that it is possible that he could be put on a plane soon in the next couple of months. The situation is as dire as it has been for Julian Assange. I don't think it's that hyperbolic for Chris Hedges or the fine team over at Sheer Post to say that the extradition could be imminent, because if you're looking at this case closely as I have, you recognize that the options are running out for Julian Assange. And you also understand that the people who are justices or judges in the British court system are extremely compromised individuals. They are not giving Julian Assange a chance to present his case and raise objections to the extradition decision that was authorized by the British government back in 2022, around the summertime. And pretty immediately he appealed it. And his attorneys argued that his press freedom rights or his rights as a journalist were being violated, along with other issues of human rights. And they wanted to go before this High Court of Justice and present their appeal, but they waited and waited. Like a lot of this case, it's almost like being in eternal limbo. You have no idea when you're going to get a chance to break free or get any resolution to it. When you do get resolutions, you usually don't win. The only time that Julian Assange was the winner in this case was back in January 2021 when, shock, the judge decided that she didn't want to have blood on her hands if Julian Assange went to the United States and committed suicide in a U.S. prison. So she kicked the can down the road and let the appeals court make a decision favorable to the U.S. government. They're constantly privileging the diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. as allies, putting that first rather than considering the issues raised by this case against Assange. And so we're at a point where the High Court might hear an appeal, or they might say they don't want to. And if they say they don't want to hear an appeal, will the legal team for Julian Assange even know? Because if they don't, then there might be a window, a very small window, before the legal team is notified that Julian Assange is picked up by authorities, put in a van, taken to a plane, and flown to the United States. And flown to the United States before he can file an appeal at the European Court of Human Rights. And that is a court that we would expect to be more favorable to the human rights issues, it's in its name, and would give better consideration than the UK courts, because the court exists outside of the United Kingdom. And there have been officials in the European Union who have demanded that this case be brought to an end, groups that are part of like cultural organizations. And so we think that he would have a better shot in front of the European Court of Human Rights. But does he get it? Can he even use that court to stop him from being transferred to the United States and being put on trial? I think that's the ultimate question right now, because the UK could defy what they know is going to happen. They know for certain that Julian Assange would appeal the outcome in this high court, in this appeals court. They know that when all the options are exhausted in the UK, he's going to try this last ditch attempt to stop the extradition through the European Court of Human Rights. So they would recognize that their best shot of avoiding the European Court of Human Rights stopping this case would be to just whisk him away on a jet, take him to the US, and now they could start the trial and they'd be home free. And we'd begin a process that is all too familiar for people who have followed President Barack Obama's war on whistleblowers, followed President Donald Trump's war on whistleblowers, seen some of the ways that the Biden White House has allowed this to continue. And they would recognize that that's going to be what Julian Assange gets put through.
Yeah, I'm getting to be an old man, Kevin. It used to be, I can remember from my childhood almost, you would think, well, let's get this guy back to the United States. I mean, we're this house on the hill that Reagan talked about. My God. But anyway, he'll get treated more fairly here. I mean, this is where he needs to. No, this country's a mess. Our judicial system is a mess. My God, look at what's going on. This is probably the worst time in American history for him to be coming over here and being plunked in the middle of this. And the point that I bring up in this Virginia court or whatever, where they're going to bring him, I mean, I've heard like there's a 95, 99% chance he's going to be convicted based on who presides over that thing. I mean, this is really bad.
You have to consider the options you have when you come to this court. So anybody who's been accused of violating the Espionage Act in this court, and just to be clear with your audience, Donald Trump is not going through this court system. If he would actually have an even harder time trying to get himself exonerated or get away with the alleged conduct. He's not going through the court system where the Air National Guard reservist Jack Teixeira has been charged. Some of your audience might be familiar with the incredible chain of events where information popped up on a Discord chat server, and we all started reading these incredible details about what was happening in the war in Ukraine and some of other U.S. foreign policy stories, sensitive U.S. foreign policy stories our government doesn't want out there. They were intended to be kept private. But Julian Assange is going through and will be brought through, if he's put on trial, the Eastern District of Virginia. It's nicknamed the Espionage Court. So when you go there, your attorneys are immediately considering whether you should seek a plea agreement, because they know that you can't argue your case. You can't go before this judge and make what is known as a public interest defense. You can't say, I was releasing this information as a whistleblower, and I would like that to be factored into this trial. Oh no, the prosecution will make sure that that's barred, and the judge will go along with the government. And so now that it's jumped from just being a targeted attack on media sources, now we're also going after publishers or journalists. Now the journalist has to argue that what they did was in the public interest. So Julian Assange would want to be able to make a defense that this journalism added to our wealth of knowledge about the world and has benefited historians, academics, politicians, entire countries that had upheavals and were able to throw off dictatorships. But the government won't let him do that. When he's in court, he's going to have to keep it to just the very small. When it's like they talk about with drones, when you're committing a strike, you are like looking through a soda straw when you do when you're going after targets. Well, they're going to force Julian Assange's legal team to look through a soda straw at just a very tiny universe of information that he can use to prove his innocence. So it's really impossible for him to make a full defense. And that means that plea deals look pretty great if you're staring at a potential of 10, 15, 20 years, maybe longer, depending on how vindictive the government would like to be. He's already been in prison for 4 years. And then I'll wrap up here by saying, if you don't take a plea agreement, then you go to trial and you're in the hands of a judge. You can have a bench trial, or you're in the hands of a jury. And where does that jury pool come from? It comes from the area that is around this district court. And that district court's area is filled with people who work for national security contractors. They work for the U.S. military. They work for the U.S. intelligence agencies. They work for the very people who have been trying to have you extradited and coming after you. And they've investigated WikiLeaks. They've investigated supposed security breaches. They've written papers against national security leaks. So you're not going to get a fair shake with them. It'll be really hard to find somebody who could be impartial and unbiased.
I'm just an old farm boy, and maybe that's the overarching thing that I've always referred to with Assange. The things that he's accused to having done, that putting people at risk, this danger that was caused by the release of this material, resulting in these mass deaths of all of our operatives and people around, it never happened. I mean, my God. So there's your proof right there that what he's being charged with is bogus. But as you mentioned, that's not going to be allowed in. Well, I want to get to the book. I mean, I keep holding this up, and I don't want to give away the whole book, obviously, but I want to hit on some of these highlights because I about wore my highlighter out reading this thing, Kevin. And I thought I knew quite a bit about the case, but you mentioned Abby Martin. Now, some of our viewers are going to be familiar with her work. She is not prone to hyperbole. This is a serious journalist who's not thrashing about out there making wild accusations and claims. But this is what Abby says. The ramifications of his case for journalists everywhere will keep imperial crimes in the shadows. And if we simply give up and allow Assange to wither away in that black box, this country is beyond saving. Prosecuting Assange will be its death knell. Now, my God, you can't. That is really serious. I mean, that's what we're looking at here, Kevin. It really is that big of a deal.
Yeah. So we just lost one of the greatest human beings and whistleblowers in U.S. history, Daniel Ellsberg.
Yeah.
And you have on the back of that book, you have his endorsement of my work, and you're welcome to read it if you would like. But what I would say about Dan here, and what I would say to what Abby wrote, is that one of the last speaking events that Dan Ellsberg was able to do before his death was at Berkeley University in California, which is not far from where he lived. And he made an important point, and he called out all of these journalists, all of these news producers, all of the people who make many of these prestigious media organizations function in the United States. And he said, the central problem with so many journalists and reporters and people like that today is that they accept the assumption put forward by the government that a crime has been committed when people come forward with information about government operations. Now think about that. Someone comes forward with information that confirms what is happening in secret, hidden from the public. People in power don't want us to have a democratic debate. It could involve wars, the authority to engage in torture, or we can use their euphemisms for a moment, harsh interrogations, enhanced interrogation techniques, that's fine. Hide warrantless wiretapping authorities, or just the authority to do any types of surveillance. These are the types of powers that are accumulating, power to be a judge, jury, and executioner and kill people from abroad. It could be from Nevada, could be from a base in New York. And we are not allowed to see this information, or those people who object are not allowed to bring forward that information and force discussions without being treated as criminals. Mm-hmm. And it's not really because we've settled the issue of whether that's a crime or not. Actually, our society has never had the Supreme Court. This is a bigger point that Ellsberg made. The Supreme Court has never decided whether it is in fact constitutional to criminalize what these whistleblowers are doing. Now, what Julian Assange did. But we've all accepted it, and our media has virtually accepted it as an okay thing to make it a crime when you release information to the public.
My God. And I've been talking about Daniel Ellsberg, the great Daniel Ellsberg, quite a bit on my show of late. People know that the framing that I put it in is Daniel Ellsberg may be one of the, if not the greatest American heroes for this reason. The risk that he put himself in, I mean, literally his life, to save, literally, I think, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of American lives, young men and some women, because of the Vietnam War, is unparalleled. And then when you look at the eastern side of the equation in Vietnam, he could have saved tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives. Who else can say that by doing this? And this is exactly what they're preventing. Now, he was a whistleblower. They're wanting people to prevent or a leaker. They're wanting people to be prevented from doing this, and Julian Assange, a publisher, from having it see the light of day. And I had this clip, not this clip, but this portion of your book that I wanted to bring up later, but I want to bring it up now because we're talking about Ellsberg. And this was really cool, revealing. I don't know how you want to describe it. Pentagon Papers whistleblower takes the stand. Now, Ellsberg testified in the extradition proceedings for Assange. Crown Prosecutor James Lewis, QC, tried to distinguish the Pentagon Papers whistleblower from Assange by casting him as a good whistleblower, And I don't think this can be overstated. I mean, we need to get to this because this has got a lot to do with this case and journalism today, because the Vietnam War was proven to be so unpopular, because everybody agrees that we should have gotten out of there and people feel better about it now. Ellsberg is viewed in this light, but he wasn't at the time. They were going to string him up by his neck for releasing that information. And he's going out there and saying the same thing about Assange. Now, the other thing about it, my understanding was he also, towards the end of his life, came out with some material saying, look, I had the same stuff that Assange did. I released the same information. I'm this American hero amongst some people. Go ahead and charge me, include me in this. I mean, this guy had cojones that are beyond compare. I mean, what a hero, Kevin.
Right. So around the age of 90, he wasn't thinking of, okay, what's my legacy? What can I do for the last few years that I'm alive? All right, I made it to 90. How much more time do I really have on this earth? He was daring the Justice Department to charge him by publicizing the fact that a thumb drive with the documents that Chelsea Manning disclosed to WikiLeaks was actually given to him, provided, I presume, by, well, I don't know that it came from Julian Assange, but someone at the WikiLeaks organization or connected gave him this drive so that he had access to the documents, and he had it on a thumb drive. He had a copy in his home or in his possession. So he's actually violated the Espionage Act. He's could be accused of what Julian Assange has been accused of doing. Although he didn't publish those materials, he's certainly possessing them. And we're learning a lot about what it means to possess classified documents, thanks to the circus around Donald Trump's case. So, yeah, this is a big deal. Ellsberg was willing to speak out against not just the war in Vietnam, but to call into question the entire U.S. nuclear weapons program and the way in which we threaten first use strikes against other countries, and what that does to the potential for Armageddon or nuclear Armageddon. And yeah, he was a very selfless individual. And what you raise in that section of my book is testimony from an extradition proceeding. It was the main 3 to 4 week proceeding that took place in September 2020, where he had an opportunity to testify in defense of Julian Assange and against the extradition. And what he argued was that all of his life, at least for the last 10 to 15 years, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, because that's when you saw the ramping up of this war on whistleblowers and the use of the Espionage Act against these people. Remember, it was Barack Obama who gained the distinction of prosecuting more whistleblowers during his tenure than all previous presidential administrations combined, something that Ellsberg would point out. And the dynamic was that Ellsberg did it the right way. In fact, I just did a segment that focused on Jonathan Capehart at Washington Post and then David Brooks at the New York Times, who were both on PBS NewsHour to reflect on Daniel Ellsberg's life, and decided that, we're more concerned about ourselves and what we wrote 10 years ago and how this makes us look since we were against Edward Snowden. So we're going to spend most of the time arguing to you an argument that we were losing against Daniel Ellsberg. And isn't it great? Because a dead man in the grave can't chime in to object to us this round. So we'll say that Snowden was no Daniel Ellsberg once more and impress upon you our belief that we think the two were different, even though there is actually no difference. And even though Dan Ellsberg actually wrote an entire column that was published by the Washington Post that said Snowden was right to flee because the country in which he came forward and exposed the Pentagon Papers was a far different country back then in the 1970s than it was today, than it is or was in the 2010s. And I would argue it's even gotten worse 10 years since then. So you would absolutely want to consider leaving the country before you blew the whistle and exposed all of these massive number of documents that you had taken with you. And that was Ellsberg's point. And in fact, hilariously, Jonathan Capehart had to come back after writing a column that was anti-Snowden, where he said, I have no rebuttal to Ellsberg here. So he crumbled. And that was Ellsberg's ability as this revered human rights defender, as this person who was a longtime peace activist, as this person of moral conscience, that even the most mealy-mouthed pundit would have to be quiet and admit that Daniel Ellsberg had a point.
Yeah, and an American hero, a real hero, folks. And they made the movie and all of that. And a lot of that to me was kind of backslapping and chest thumping on the part of the prestige media, as it's described in Kevin's book, The Times and the Post, about the heroic things that they did to publish. And now the heroism was this guy that was looking at having his life imprisoned. That was Daniel Ellsberg, folks. Don't ever forget that. Just a great American hero. One of the reasons that I got involved in this business, obviously, I put it in terms of the Pentagon Papers, also Watergate, and where the hell is Robert Woodward? God, why isn't he speaking out? He should be on national television. He does have a microphone. They will platform that guy, unlike a lot of his other defenders. They won't get on Meet the Press. Woodward could. Where the hell is that guy? All right, we're going to run out of time with Kevin, because he and I could talk about this all day. I want to do a couple of quick hitters here just by way of background. We've talked about this stuff before, Kevin. And again, quickly deal with the thing that Assange is not a journalist. That's right at the top of the list.
Yeah, so that's the first chapter of my book. That's the first sentence is Julian Assange is a journalist. And I decided to just run right at that as fast as I could and hit the brick wall and just completely obliterate it, because that is, I think, worthy of discussion. There are reputable press freedom organizations and human rights groups that will tell you it doesn't really matter if you think Julian Assange is a journalist or not, because he engaged in journalism and that's protected. So we don't have to agree on what we call Julian Assange. But I know, and everybody else who's involved in this struggle understands that the reason that he isn't given that label or allowed to have that label is because the US government has gone above and beyond to discredit him. And if he was recognized as a journalist, it would be harder for them to bring the Espionage Act case against him. So we look at an earlier case like James Risen, who was alleged to be the source of whistleblower Jeffrey Sterling. Now, that was never proven, but apparently the Justice Department was convinced that James Risen was the person that Jeffrey Sterling had gone to with information for his book on President George W. Bush's administration. And they wanted to force Risen to give up his confidential sources and testify in court. Okay, so he had a lot of support, and people understood that what Attorney General Eric Holder and the Justice Department were doing and what the Bush administration started was really out of line. But you don't have that same viewpoint, because there isn't consensus that Julian Assange is a journalist. It's important to struggle over this fact and make the pointed argument, or make people understand the facts. The facts are that he has had membership in 2 journalist unions. One is in Australia. It's the Media, Entertainment, and Arts Alliance. There's also the International Federation of Journalists that has granted him membership. And now there are dozens of organizations, I believe, throughout Europe that have granted him honorary membership just for the purpose of helping him fight this battle against the United States. And you look at the definition that the Committee to Protect Journalists used for a journalist, and you see that it isn't just people who publish documents like Julian Assange that are covered, but it's people who engage in commentary. It's people who go on radio shows, television news programs, and are invited to comment, which is what Julian Assange was doing. We need to remember that Julian Assange wasn't just the editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, but he'd go on Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman to discuss Google or to discuss NSA surveillance. You go on CNN and discuss those issues as well, or maybe give a comment on Edward Snowden. So he was someone who the news media recognized as a kind of authority on U.S. national security and military issues because of what WikiLeaks was publishing.
All right, let's get to another one here because this is something that I come across. You mentioned the situation with Capehart. You can have these discussions and arguments with people and win every single point. But the slur that they'll pull out of the septic tank, the thing that they will throw in your face is this deal with the Swedish courts and this rape allegation. The Me Too thing is very powerful, and they'll shake this in front of your face and say, well, what about this? Well, I tell people that the International Women Against Rape Protection Organization says Assange is innocent until proven guilty. They didn't put any credence in this. The witnesses, Kevin, they got amnesia when it came time for, this thing to move forward, and it never did. To me, that is nothing more than what it appears to be, which is just a smear.
When I put the book together, I was solely focused on what would come up in a U.S. trial. And none of these allegations from Sweden are likely to surface in a U.S. trial. A prosecutor could mention them maybe in a closing argument. Usually that's when prosecutors are the most vindictive and want to have a parting shot. I'm recalling what happened in Chelsea Manning's military trial because I was one of the few journalists to cover every single day of that trial. And when we got to the end in the closing argument, the military prosecutor really turned up the vindictiveness of it. And we're calling out Chelsea Manning as like a traitor and an anarchist, somebody who would be willing to like burn the American flag, essentially, who had no patriotism. She was an atheist. They were using all these charged words to turn off the judge and help them win a favorable decision. I'm not sure that it worked, by the way, but this was their effort to try and get the needle moved a bit further in the direction that they wanted against Chelsea Manning. And they could do that against Julian Assange. They could say, well, he's an accused rapist. They could say that in the courtroom. They could say he's an accused Russian puppet as well. But I don't know what that would have to do with the allegations. So if they had a jury, it might work. If you have a judge, the judge is going to just look at the law and ignore that language. They're going to be well aware of what the prosecutors are doing. So I don't really deal with the Swedish allegations. My recommendation to people who want to see how flimsy these allegations were and understand all the due process issues and violations of due process rights that unfolded during this would be to turn to Niels Meltzer's book, the on the persecution against Julian Assange that came out from Verso, because his is a more internationally focused book, and he spent a lot of time because he had access to these leaders and officials, and he was able to collect a lot of documentation to demonstrate what had gone on that was improper or didn't quite add up in the Swedish case. But what I would also say, again, I would emphasize that when he gets to that courtroom, we are talking about the allegations under the Espionage Act. And fortunately, and unfortunately for the US government, fortunately for Julian Assange, the stuff that has happened in the bedroom with some women who made allegations against him are not material to whether Julian Assange should be protected as a journalist. I mean, that would be true for anybody. I mean, any of even the most honorable individual, they do great journalism, and for some reason they were accused of doing some engaged in some personal crime, some crime, burglary, whatever it might be. Their work would still be protected under the First Amendment. You don't lose the rights to be engaged in journalism because you go out and steal something or hack into. I mean, like they've accused him of hacking, but that's a separate allegation from all of this journalism that he's engaged. So to be specific, they've accused him of conspiracy to commit a computer intrusion, which is actually not quite hacking. I'm sorry, I stumbled and used that word, but separately, are these issues of journalism is much different. But just because you accuse somebody of a crime, petty or severe, it doesn't mean that they lose their First Amendment rights.
All right, let's get to some things here. I've made these clips, and again, I apologize for what they look like. This is just off my flatbed scanner, folks. And Kevin's talked about this Espionage Act several times, and he mentioned this. But I want, again, because so much of this is political, and you got to remember the political case against Julian Assange is the subtitle for the book. And to underscore what Kevin talked about earlier, in fact, during President Bill Clinton's final months in office, he vetoed legislation on November in 2000 that would have given the U.S. government the power to prosecute any person who revealed official secrets, including whistleblowers or even ambassadors who briefed news reporters. Now, again, this Democrats aren't going to believe Obama pursued more than twice as many leak prosecutions as there were in all previous administrations combined. And I remember in your book, Kevin, you mentioned that Obama had a real issue, a real problem with leakers. I mean, this is a big deal with him, and that's why he dug up this 1917 Espionage Act to go after him.
Right. So people have memories of President Donald Trump and how he would go on Twitter and be outraged at the New York Times or the Washington Post for what they were publishing about his administration that day. He would say, something to the effect of like, we need to hang all those leakers and haul them in here and stop this immediately. Well, Obama didn't do that. He was a controlled person. He understood politics. He didn't talk like that. But privately and internally, I think it might be fair to say that he was as frustrated and angry with leaks as Donald Trump. And I don't think that's hyperbole. I think that he had a dislike for it just as much. Maybe not that he thought people in his administration were out to get him, but he had this resentment because he thought that, all right, we're all a team. We all need to be on the same page here. And if someone is going to the media and sharing what we're doing when we're trying to make this all work quietly, privately, it's going to become disruptive and we're not going to be able to do this. Well, yeah, because now you're going to have public accountability. They're going to want to question what you're doing if they have an objection, if people, do not like the step forward that you are taking, whether it be with a war, surveillance, torture, Guantanamo Bay, you name it. And so, yeah, he had this really great disgust. But President Bill Clinton, I note that he rejected expanding the ability to go after leaks, which we know would have been used against whistleblowers. I think we can imagine a whole universe of journalism being shut down. Imagine if that law had been in effect after the September 11th attacks and what Bush and Cheney would have been able to do with a law like that. And President Bill Clinton actually commuted, or I think actually might have, I believe it was a pardon. Sorry, he wasn't in prison anymore. It was a pardon of Samuel Morrison, who was a really well-known leak case that I mentioned in my book under the Espionage Act. And again, he didn't have any malice. He had actually wanted to alert the government to what he believed was a threat. And this happened in the 80s when Reagan was president. And then he wound up being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And Clinton saw that that was an inappropriate way for the U.S. government to use its power. But we don't have that today anymore. We don't have anybody who's really, aside from what Obama did with commuting Chelsea Manning's sentence, there has been no one who has looked at the way the Justice Department has applied the Espionage Act to go, oh, I don't think we should do this like this. I think we've gone too far. There was a judge early during the 2000, it would have been like 2010, 2011-ish, I think. There was a judge in NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake's case, who I quote in the book, who just went after and ripped the prosecutors to shreds for what they did to Thomas Drake. He was this really excellent national security employee who did everything that you would expect. He had objections to the way surveillance was being developed. And, he lost his position and had to go work in an Apple store. And he no longer could be somebody who could consult and work in national security because of what the Justice Department did to him. When he went to the Inspector General, I think he had a couple other cohorts who went and exposed a program. Well, the Inspector General gave his name to the Justice Department, and now he was under investigation. So the leaker who raises wrongdoing, and I would say whistle blew the right way, which is what Jonathan Capehart and David Brooks would tell you, is now the target and finds himself under investigation. Not the people who are wasting your taxpayer dollars on a program for Michael Hayden that doesn't work. Not the people who are authorizing unconstitutional surveillance after 9/11. No, the people who speak out are having their homes raided and are being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And so that is another important case to show you just how far afield we have come. And the book, particularly that Espionage Act chapter, along with the chapter about what happens to whistleblowers in prisons, is to show you the progression. And I think the main takeaway that I want people to have when they read my book is that each case stacks upon the other. Yeah. Each one gives the Justice Department one new thing that they can do to people who should not be targeted and prosecuted. And it's happening now. And to be impartial and fair, it could happen in Donald Trump's case, not because I think Donald Trump shouldn't be held accountable, but just because prosecutors are savvy and they know how to accumulate power in the way that they are able to operate in a courtroom and before a judge. This is a very crucial tool that they have used to try and deter people from releasing classified information, to make people afraid of coming forward. Lower level people, not Donald Trump. Because usually people like Donald Trump don't have to be afraid. Usually they don't have to be afraid. I mean, look, if somebody comes to your house and you have boxes of documents and you don't give them up, you only have yourself to blame for getting prosecuted by the Justice Department. But usually you'll be able to bargain. General David Petraeus learned that he could bargain away and prevent himself from being charged with a felony. It's the lower level people who have morally and conscientious objections to the secrecy and the actions that are being taken, in which they feel they are complicit. And all of these people, take Assange out of the equation for now, because I think he's an anomaly, since I don't think the Espionage Act should apply to him, especially because he's not even a U.S. citizen. But just consider the people who have been prosecuted. These are people who believe in the government agencies in which they work. They want them to work better. They are Americans and they are patriots, and they all are motivated. A lot of them joined these agencies. When we're talking about the people prosecuted under Obama's presidency, they joined these agencies after 9/11. They're motivated to fight back against the people who attacked the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. They want to join in the fight. And some of these people, they deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq because they were motivated to do. Some of them were poor and they turned to the military because they needed to do so if they were going to have any kind of a future. But to consider going there. They believe in the mission. They believe in the mission of fighting terrorism. And then they see what the reality is of fighting the global war on terrorism, and their objections lead to their demise, to their fate, to them being put in prison or being prosecuted under the Espionage Act and being hit with felonies or misdemeanors and going through this life-changing event in which nothing will ever be the same again.
All right, so to review very briefly, as Kevin mentioned, Obama, I mean, he's the espionage guy. He's the guy that opened the septic tank, but he didn't charge Assange. Trump did. And so you got these guys that are the tip of the spear when it comes to these charges. But I like to get this from the book, too, because this guy is the spear chucker. This guy is one of my arch villains that appears on my show a lot in the form of a video clip. I'm going to play this here. It says, you don't get to love truth one day and seek suppression the next. Days after Assange's arrest, Pompeo infamously said during a Q&A session at Texas A&M University, I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, and we stole. I got this clip. Here, watch this.
When I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
The glory of the American experiment, which some people still believe in. My God, that is just a prophecy. I mean, it's unbelievable what Pompeo said on the record in that thing. And people are applauding in the audience, you know, and cheering. You can hear them there. My God, this is the new America, the circumstances that we live in. And a lot of Assange's situation is because of this spear chucker, the tip of the spear that I talked about with Trump. That's the reason that he's pending extradition right now to the United States. They went and got him with great vindictiveness. You talked about this earlier, Kevin.
Correct. So Mike Pompeo, we can all breathe a sigh of relief, has decided and come to the understanding that he could never win the nomination for the Republican Party and run for president.
Yes.
So I think we're fortunate to be rid of him for the moment, because he is, in my sense, one of the more unhinged individuals to come out of the Trump era with influence. And this guy was the Secretary of State under Trump, and he was also the CIA director. When he was CIA director, one of his first acts, because WikiLeaks published materials from the CIA on the CIA's offensive cyber hacking capabilities, was to, instead of engaging in an open conversation about powers that, again, had been secretly taken and seized by different agencies without any debate, we didn't have any discussion about what we wanted to do that could potentially set off a really damaging chain of events between the U.S. and China, between the U.S. and Russia, or any other powerful country that we decided to oppose. He decided that his first speech would be an attack on WikiLeaks, an attack on Julian Assange, and a statement that WikiLeaks was going to be targeted as a non-state hostile intelligence service, which he created this label so that the CIA could have the power to wage a disruption campaign. We know this from an excellent, a rare example of journalism, but an excellent example of journalism from what we could call part of the prestige media. Maybe they're a little bit closer to the fringe of that than other outlets, but Yahoo News produced an investigative report with Michael Isikoff, Sean Naylor, and Zach Dorfman that looked at the over 30 officials and their claims. They were from the Trump administration, from the Justice Department, and they claimed that Pompeo had wanted to kidnap or kill Julian Assange from the Ecuador embassy, had sketched war plans. There were all these discussions about what they could do. It was part of a pressure campaign to force Julian Assange out of the embassy. We do not have time for this. This is frankly its own conversation, separate from what is going to happen to Julian Assange under the Espionage Act, but connected. But this is a parallel criminal case that is unfolding in Spain right now, with Julian Assange alleging that his privacy was violated in a Spanish court because a Spanish private security company hired to provide security at the Ecuador embassy was eavesdropping and spying on his conversations with lawyers, with people who were doctors, with visitors, journalists who came to visit him. There's a lawsuit that's unfolding in the United States in the Southern District of New York that I've covered, with American visitors who claim that their rights were violated because they had their contents of their electronic devices inappropriately and unconstitutionally copied and taken by CIA agents. I won't go much further, but just to say that this director, David Morales, is accused of crimes in Spain. And we now know, because of this court case, that the CIA was involved in spying on Julian Assange. Now, you may say to me, well, didn't we know that? Wasn't that true? We could always say that. No, even if we didn't know it, didn't we believe it? And, well, just because I'm a journalist and I like to deal in facts and I need to have things corroborated before I go around and spread my conspiracy theories, which is fine. Conspiracy theories can exist. Conspiracies do happen between the U.S. government and other countries, and do happen within the U.S. government even, and seem to have happened in this case. But we find that this guy, David Morales, had a folder on his computer that he labeled CIA, and it had videos and audio and other recordings in it that were being passed along back to some agency in the U.S., presumably the CIA. The FBI probably got its hands on these recordings as well. So the Justice Department says that this information is not going to taint their case. It hasn't mixed. But whatever you hear them say to rationalize and justify it or deny that any of this happened, they claim that Julian Assange is a wanted fugitive, so it was fair to target him. He's a journalist, so I don't actually accept the premise that he's a wanted fugitive. And let's just end here on this part of our discussion by recalling that Daniel Ellsberg had his psychiatrist's office broken into by the White House plumbers. And if you asked him, he would tell you the reason why the Vietnam War ended was not because of the Pentagon Papers and what was in those documents. Sadly, they came out, and a couple of years later, the war was still unfolding, and we had not withdrawn all of U.S. troops from Vietnam. So it didn't inspire a lot of confidence in the U.S. government to read this information and correct our actions. But when people found that the White House plumbers were going around and breaking into the Democratic Party and Ellsberg's office and all of that, that was when the judge in Daniel Ellsberg's case threw it out and decided that the trial could not move forward. And he just was lucky. He avoided an Espionage Act conviction. He didn't say ever in his lifetime that he would not have been convicted. I think he believed he would have been convicted if Nixon and Kissinger and these plumbers and all these people, even Roger Stone's involved in what's going on, because there's an incredible moment that many people may not know where Dan Ellsberg's on the Capitol steps there to give a speech. This is in 1972. And the CIA has come up with this kind of dirty tricks campaign. And Roger Stone is somehow involved. He's in college at that time. And all these students are going to go there and they want people to like attack Daniel Ellsberg and
kneecap him.
Kneecap him. Yeah.
My God. Well, all right. So, and we're running out of time here. I just, I'm reminded, now that Ecuadorian security thing can't be overstated again, because the great Chris Hedges, who's endorsed Kevin's work, he's a fan of this book particularly, has said, and he'll say right off the top, because those attorneys were there that Kevin mentioned, the attorney-client privilege relationship has been compromised. And that, if nothing else, forget all this other stuff, means that the case legally ought to be tossed. I mean, the defending attorney ought to be able to stand up and point that out to the judge or jury or whatever and get it dismissed on that grounds. But it's very unlikely that that's happening. Okay, I got to move through the book here. I want to get to the very end of this because, you know, my big three on PBG, the Podcast by George show, Kevin. It's climate, war, and healthcare. And I scanned this because if you don't think that this Assange case and WikiLeaks is important, this pretty much drives it home. You list these 30 WikiLeaks files the U.S. government doesn't want you to read. And let's say that you're a war hawk and you are all up with whatever he revealed in the Iraq files and the Afghan logs and, the Apache helicopter video. And if you think that that's okay, well, okay. Do you care about climate? I mean, every scientist in the world basically says it's going to get us within the next 20 years, probably. That's at the top of the list, just like it is on my show, climate, war, and healthcare. This is why people should support Assange and support this work, not just for him, just not for them, Kevin, but for us.
That's correct. Yeah, there's a whole range of issues that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks brought us additional information so that we could take it and do with it what was necessary to try and take some control of our lives. So we see when it comes to climate change that these deals, these agreements that are being negotiated internationally, you have dozens of countries that come to the table and they want to break through. They want to actually do something meaningful to stem the tide and mitigate the human impacts that are making it so we see record temperatures in India. It's virtually unlivable right now in India, or has been for the last month. Look at Texas right now. It's 120 degrees. If you think that's normal and just part of summer, then you should do like the flat earthers and go to the edge of the planet and just jump off into oblivion, because it really, I don't know how to save you. I don't know what you need to see to recognize that 120 degrees is just not a tolerable temperature for human life. That being said, I don't want to go off too far on a tangent. We see that the people, our world leaders from these WikiLeaks files, have negotiated agreements that benefit each other. I mean, we even have US and China, who are diametrically opposed, saying, oh, well, we want to protect fossil fuels and you want to protect your industry in China. So let's work together to make sure that these smaller countries don't get a strong climate deal. And that was what WikiLeaks exposed. Then you see trade agreements. WikiLeaks exposed these like Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And there was another one called TISA. So they're exposing these deals that are going to give more sovereignty to corporations. There's another book I'll recommend from a colleague of mine, Matt Kennard, called Silent Coup: How Corporations Overthrew Democracy. But this is part of what WikiLeaks was exposing, where you see the rise of corporate cities, you see the rise of corporate justice, corporate armies, etc. And these kind of deals that WikiLeaks exposed, that was where we were going towards. I highlight Israel and Palestine. I highlight what's going on and what we found out with wars. The embassy cable is the first time we really learned that drone strikes are being hidden from the public, with Yemen helping the Obama administration cover up drone strikes. And there are just too many to name, but there's 30 in there that I think are possibly some of the more consequential ones. Again, they give you something to talk about. And we need to, the last point I'll make here for your show, George, is just say that the media is very good. The prestige media is very good at getting us to just talk about Julian Assange and Reality Winner or Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden or Daniel Hale or Thomas Drake, John Kiriakou. Go down the list of all these people, Terry Albury, all of these important individuals who take risks, Jeffrey Sterling. But what they do very well is they get us to talk about these people and whether they're heroes or traitors, and they get us trapped in this conversation. That means that we aren't spending time discussing the information that they came forward with to expose, which is really what exonerates them, which is really what makes them profound human beings who have taken risks and deserve to be protected and defended in their attacks from the US government. Because, these people who we talk about, that I talk about, I've spent a lot of time discussing over the last decade. They don't just become important to me because I happen to know them or I talk to them or, they're they're cool people to hang around with. No, they exposed this information. So we should talk about these secrets that the US government wants to keep hidden from us. And by making that known to everyone, by making sure that people understand what they revealed, we're going to make it easier for people to stop this case. We're going to make it harder for the government to defend prosecuting somebody like Julian Assange.
Well, buy the book. Here it is again. And we're talking to author Kevin Gosztola, Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. As I mentioned, he's a great, he's great in broadcast, obviously, as we can see on the show. He's a great writer. I mean, and the website's great. And the book he's a great author. But I was really impressed here recently. And I want to end with this because I want to show this. Because this is chilling, and maybe you've got an update on this, Kevin. Maybe this has improved or changed. But this was you speaking recently at an Assange rally, and this was kind of a jaw dropper for me. I saved this clip. Watch this.
And just to give you some specifics, the last thing I want to leave you with is I didn't know that any polling agency had any interest in Julian Assange anymore. But within the last months, Morning Consult actually did a poll on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and asked people what they know and what they remember. And I have bad news for you. Nearly half of US adults that were polled said they did not know who Julian Assange was as a person. Not even the propaganda that has been fed to them by the media. They couldn't even regurgitate that. They didn't know who Julian Assange was. And when they were asked about the publications in which he's being prosecuted for publishing, the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, they didn't know. They didn't know what those publications. Nearly 60% of people in London or the UK, in the United States, and in Australia, which has actually made this an issue. The Australians get a lot of credit because they've turned it into a political issue in which their politicians actually have to take sides. Well, that makes sense because he's an Australian citizen. But he's coming to this country, and we ought to make him a bigger political issue here in this country because that's the only way that it's going to become a thing in which he gets freed.
Yeah, and the only way people are going to become aware because of this independent left-wing media, of which I'm a very small part of here, this fabric that I'm talking about, because this issue is not getting platformed. It's not talked about on MSNBC, Donald Trump every single minute of every day, my God. And then this fiasco in Russia is an example of how they focus in on something that turns out to be a nothing burger. I mean, those polling numbers that you cite are shocking to me because of the significance of this issue, Kevin. Is that still where this is at in your mind?
Yeah, I don't see what would have moved the needle. I think, if anything, you might find more support for ending the case in Australia. I believe that people in the United Kingdom are still as in the dark, maybe not quite as bad as the United States, but so the only thing that might give me some kind of bizarre optimism is that, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I think Donald Trump shouldn't be held accountable for anything that he has done that is corrupt. But today, one of the Republican candidates for 2024, who I don't support, and I believe they are destined to fail in their efforts to become the nominee. But that being said, they're using the platform that they have as a candidate to say that the Espionage Act should be repealed, abolished. And they're citing Donald Trump's case. And they're actually putting forward a pretty good argument based in history and fact. And that's Vivek Ramaswamy, who in the Wall Street Journal, you can read a summary of the ugly history of the Espionage Act. So I don't know what's happening. Our politics have been incredibly bizarre since 2016, but you're seeing more and more Republicans recognize that the Espionage Act is wrong because they think, and I think there's something wrong about their assessment, but they believe that Donald Trump's a dissenter against the deep state who is under attack, and that the Espionage Act is now coming for him. And so that might impact the ability of this national security state to be able to weaponize the Espionage Act going forward. especially if more Republicans speak up. You don't have a lot of Democrats that are tuned into this, but remember, it was Barack Obama, and Obama's their president. Liberals loved Barack Obama, and they virtually ignored what happened with the Espionage Act during his tenure. And then they discovered Donald Trump used it against Reality Winner. They're speaking out against that. It's an excellent film that was produced, and can find it on HBO, about the interrogation of her and how she wasn't read her rights. And it was very predatory the way that the FBI came after her. And that case was a sham. And I write about it in the book because each case builds on each one to get us to the Assange prosecution. And I think that what we're seeing in Australia is probably the best hope for Julian Assange, because maybe the leaders of his country can do something to stop this. Maybe they can force an end. Maybe some of the international focus on the U.S. government can stop it. I don't have a lot of hope within the United States that people within the United States will force an end and save Julian Assange. But that doesn't mean that that is the ultimate end, because I'm just speaking about now. We can always build hope. We can always change that dynamic so that this can be stopped. And it might get better when he's in Alexandria, Virginia, because that distance, well, we are separated by the pond that we call the Atlantic Ocean. And when he's here, it'll be even more real for everybody else that the proceedings, the legal case starts to churn forward, and we're moving towards a trial. And maybe we'll see more outrage. But no matter what, the last 4 or 5 years, it's a black mark on this country, in particular the U.S. Congress, because you only have 7 members of Congress, and they're all representatives, no senators, who have said anything to the Justice Department where they demand that these charges be dropped. So that's over 500 people who are elected, over 400 representatives, Congress people, and then all 100. That includes some of the people you think are liberal darlings like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, haven't said anything to demand that Joe Biden drop these charges right now. So I think that will always be a real black mark on U.S. history, because something could have been done. If anyone in Congress had gotten together and said, whoa, pump these brakes, they would, because we've heard all sorts of an uproar over Hunter Biden, over Donald Trump investigations. I've been hearing rumblings from Republicans about the IRS, but I don't really take any of that seriously, because they're not actually going at the heart of power and challenging it to stop this case against Julian Assange.
Well, that's a great close. Here again is the book. Let me get it on the screen. There you go, folks. Guilty of Journalism, the great Kevin Gosztola. And, I'm reminded of Roger Waters when he was talking to that Smirkomish, that bald knobber knucklehead on CNN or MSNBC, whatever it was. I think it was CNN. You need to read more. He's talking about Ukraine. So this Assange issue, the significance of this, the ins and outs of this, get that book. Read it. It ain't that difficult. It's not that expensive, and it's a good read. It's a quick read, and you'll be, smarty pants when it comes to Julian Assange and be supporting. You'll be on the correct side of this. Kevin, thanks again, as always. And we'll stay tuned. Maybe this week, who knows? It's going to happen quickly, I think. The next development with Julian Assange. Here's Mary Knox. I want to get her comment on it. Donald Trump took an oath to protect the U.S. from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Assange took no such oath. Yeah, you talk about that in the book. These now, it's a little different in the UK. They do have laws on the book, but the First Amendment protects people like Assange in this country. Okay, we got to let him go because we're over time here. But Kevin, thanks again for coming on Podcast by George.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to be in D.C. I'd expect to follow this trial. So anybody who wants to can stay tuned for updates over at my Dissenter newsletter at thedissenter.org. So thank you.
That's great. And folks, if you like seeing Kevin Gosztola, if you like having this type of insight on these major issues of our day, the importance of this, as I've said over and over, it's really significant, folks. Subscribe to Podcast by George. It's easy. It's free. You can do it at podcastbygeorge.com. Just go to my webpage, pick an icon there where you'd like to be notified, where you'd like to see these live streams and video on Facebook and on YouTube. You can click those little badges there. But then if you like to hear the audio, and this is a long one, the show today, if you just want to listen to this while you're out in your car, out and about on your bicycle, jogging, whatever the case might be, listening on your phone, you can go to iTunes is the most popular, but Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, even Amazon Music has it, all kinds of places. Those are all at podcastbygeorge.com. But that's going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.